Hey guys, it's Timothy here. We are looking at official spoiler season for Amonkhet. We've already had quite a few cards drop before spoiler season started, so we've gotten a good look at the set so far. But we're going to look at the actual day one spoilers here. Quite a few. We have one of the gods that we had a pretty good idea we were getting, and a bunch of other kind of interesting stuff going on. There are a lot of mechanics in this set. We're going to see even some more stuff today that we weren't aware of before. But we're going to start with what we have on screen here. And just talk about the cards like normal. So let me know what you think. If I misread a card, please let me know. I have done that a couple times, and people have corrected me. So please let me know so I can remand that statement, please. So if you notice I misread something or I evaluate it in a way that's not really true, go ahead and let me know so we can take care of that. But anyway. Let's start off with this white card here. We have an instant called In Okhetra's Name, I believe. Okhetra is the white god, if I'm not mistaken, the god of solidarity. But In Okhetra's Name is 1 and a white for a common instant. Zombies you control get +2/+1 until end of turn. Other creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. This is interesting for a number of reasons. First off, you guys know that zombie tribal support is usually in black. If you look at what we have in standard right now from Innistrad mostly, it's all black and blue, right? Maybe there's a red zombie here and there, I'm not sure. But as we know from this set, Embalm, the mechanic Embalm, does make white zombie tokens, so that makes sense that In Okhetra's Name is a white spell here. And even the art has a bunch of mummies in it, right? So the whole idea of embalming is that you mummify a living creature, and when it dies, it comes back as a mummy, undead zombie, I guess. The card itself, I'm not sure how this is going to pan out. So 2 mana to give your entire team +1/+1 isn't as good as it sounds. It's not terrible, but it's no like inspired charge. It is on the cheap side though, so doing for this for 2 mana is acceptable. It's just not super powerful. Even +2/+1 wouldn't be like amazing, but is the type of boost that you can win a game off of if you're able to go wide enough. The interesting thing here is though that it really wants you to be playing a zombie deck, and most of the zombies are in black unless you're doing a lot of embalming, but as we've seen from the embalm cards that we already have, embalming is pretty mana intensive, and it's the type of thing that builds up a board over time rather than flooding the board with a bunch of tokens. So I don't know how feasible it's going to be that you can get a bunch of zombies on board by using the embalm mechanic, and then using this to kind of win the game or something along those lines. I don't know. We'll have to see some really cheap embalm cards or some really cheap zombie cards, and most of the zombies we've seen are like centered in black. So I don't know. Maybe there's a black-white theme of zombies here for limited. Maybe not. But as is, if all you're getting out of this card is +1/+1, it's not an impressive card. But at 2 mana, it is acceptable. So I think it's playable. Just probably a weaker card. Jerus Resolve. Don't know who Jeru is. This might be Planeswalker that we're getting from the set. Maybe the one from the trailer, if you've seen that. If not, go check it out. But Jerus Resolve is 1 white for a common instant. Untap target creature. Prevent all damage that would be dealt to it this turn. Or you can cycle this for 2 mana. So this is a really weak combat trick. It doesn't give any boosts. It does guarantee that you're going to be able to block something and soak up all the damage if it doesn't have trample, and maybe even use that profitably to kill your opponent's creature. Plus, it has the extra little advantage of being 1 mana and untapping your creature, so it can really surprise people. This is the type of card that you need to watch out for on pre-release. If you're not aware of it, it can really get you in a tight spot, especially since you might expect if your opponent only has 1 mana up, they might not be able to do very much. But the thing that makes me like this card, even though I think it's a weaker card, is Cyclone, obviously. Cyclone just makes every card better. If a card is weak and you put Cyclone on it, it becomes a playable card. Just cantripping if you need it, and figuring out whether or not you need a card or whether or not you need to hold this up is pretty decent. The reason it's good on combat tricks in general like this is because you normally hold up mana for your combat tricks anyway, and if it turns out you don't need to, maybe your opponent never attacks you, doesn't make an attack, and you don't have to use this to save a creature, you can just cycle it and replace it with something else. Preferably something a little more proactive. As is, I don't think the card's that strong, but it is the cycling, like I said, does make it a little bit better. And if we see a lot of payoffs for cycling, especially in white, this is the type of card you might want to have in mind because it's cheap to cast and you can always just trade it off if you need to. As is, though, the effect on it isn't great, but it's a playable card. Again, I feel like I'm going to say that a lot here. Cycling cards, though, are all playable. You would be hard-pressed to make a cycling card that just isn't good. Trial of Knowledge. So trials are a thing in this set. It's too early to see, or too early to make really a judgment call. This is the only trial we've seen so far. But as far as I know, trials are enchantments that have an enter the battlefield trigger of some sort of static ability maybe, and then they have this extra clause on them. So we'll see what that's all about here. Trial of Knowledge is 3 and a blue for an uncommon enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you draw 3 cards, and then you discard a card. And it says when a cartouche, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right or not, when a cartouche enters the battlefield under your control, return Trial of Knowledge to its owner's hand. So a couple things going on here. First off, we need to see what a cartouche is, and we'll see in just a second. It's basically just a aura type. So the cartouches will bounce your trials back to your hands. I guess the flavor is a cartouche is like a medal, I guess you get for winning something. I don't know. It's along those lines, right? A little more sophisticated than that, but essentially a medal, right? An honorarium, and you get it, and then you finish your trial, right? So you get to bounce the trial back, and then you get to start the trial again. I guess that's the flavor behind this. But as is this card good or not? I think it's fine. Sorcery speed, draw 3, discard 1 seems like a good card. It's very similar to Compulsive Research, which if you haven't played before, Compulsive Research is just a good card. This is great card selection. It reminds me of Oath of Jace, which was a fine playable card. Granted, that was 1 mana less. If there's a real control game going on in Limited and you can afford to tap out for a 4 mana enchantment without being under a lot of pressure, then I think this card is quite good. And I don't know. We have to see what the cartouches are like before I really evaluate that last part. If the cartouches end up being just stone cold unplayable, then that last part doesn't matter so much, but being able to rebuy it, so to speak, and then discard cards to your graveyard is pretty nice. Also, keep in mind that whole discard a card thing is very relevant in this set, the same way it was for Shadows over Innistrad and Eldritch Moon, because we do have cards that matter in the graveyard, namely the Aftermath cards, and we'll see another one here today, I believe. We've already seen one, and that's a confirmed real card. So Aftermath is a mechanic in the set, and anything that can discard kind of sets you up to be able to Aftermath a card from your graveyard without ever having to cast it from your hand in the first place. So I don't know. I think this card's good. I really do. If all we did was stop at the first ability, I think it would be a playable card. Granted, not a super strong one, but the card selection is nice, and the ability to possibly get to do it again later in the game is pretty sweet too. We have a cartouche here. If I'm mispronouncing that, I'm really sorry. Like, someone's just groaning at home. Like, it's not pronounced cartouche. But anyway, 1 white mana for Cartouche of Solidarity. This is a common. It is an aura, and you'll notice it actually has a subtype cartouche, so the last card referenced this. I imagine there's got to be 1 for each color, but we'll see. I believe that actually that's been confirmed by Wizards that there will be 1 cartouche, or at least it's a cycle, if not a couple more outside of the cycle. But it enchants a creature you control. When it enters the battlefield, you get a 1/1 warrior creature token with vigilance. Just a warrior, no other creature type. It is white though. And enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has first strike. So first thing I would say about this card is be careful thinking about this as a 1 mana 1/1, because you can't play this on turn 1. You have to have a creature in order to enchant in the first place. It has to be the creature you control. So you're not playing this on turn 1. You're very likely not playing this on turn 2 unless you have other 1-drops in your deck. So you're looking at around turn 3+ for this card to matter. Now, if you can stick this on an early creature and get that creature in, then the card justifies itself. But as is, it's not super powerful, right? +1/+1 and first strike is enough to make a creature relevant in combat and make it really tough to deal with. But you need to make sure this last part matters here. If all you're getting is a 1/1 vigilant creature and you're not able to attach this to something that's going to be able to attack profitably, the card gets way, way weaker, right? It does matter what the white's what is it called? The white trial is going to be. If the white trial is really, really good, then it incentivizes you to have the white cartouche because they'll go hand in hand with each other, and it'll be a way for you to bounce the trial back to your hand. That's assuming the trials all work that way. It might be too soon to say that, but I'm assuming they all function in that way where you play a cartouche, you get the trial back. From a flavor perspective, that makes sense. But this card is, again, playable. I'm going to, like I've already said that twice. This is the third time. But it's not super strong. And it's hard to get 2-for-1 off of this because you do get that 1/1 Vigilant creature off of it. But that's not really a high payoff. So you need to make sure this last part matters. And this card could go way up in evaluation if the white trial is worth it. But as is, I think this card is a pass in my book. But I don't know. That's just my perspective on it. I don't think it's super strong. I'm not clamoring for +1/+1 in First Strike, even though I do admit that is relevant on a lot of creatures. It does make First Strike just makes creatures really hard to deal with. Anyway, moving on. Crocodile. Crocodile of the Crossing is 3 and a green for a 5/4 uncommon crocodile creature with haste. And when it enters the battlefield, you put a -1/-1 counter on target creature you control. So the gimmick here is that if this is your only creature, you have to put the counter on itself, and then it becomes a 4/3 haste for 4, which is marginally worse. Oftentimes that'll come down and it'll just trade off for a creature your opponent controls if it's coming down on turn 4. But a 5/4 haste is significantly bigger, especially on turn 4, and being able to slam in for 5 is pretty good. This is on an uncommon creature, just to mention. Now, where this gets really good is you can toss a -1/-1 counter on a creature that you control that you don't mind it having a counter on, right? Something maybe with really high toughness, something that you played before turn 4, and then you set this thing up to be able to attack pretty early. It's just a very efficient body on a haste creature for 4 mana, and I imagine this is going to be a really strong card. It's just going to be a little bit weaker when you have to play it and put the counter on itself. So there are times where that'll happen, but when it doesn't happen, I think this card is going to be great. Or at least that's my perspective. If you have any sort of bonus for putting a -1/-1 counter on your own creature, then that's also something to note here, and Nest of Scarabs is a good example of this. The card is 2 and a black for an uncommon enchantment. Whenever you put 1 or more -1/-1 counters on a creature, and notice it doesn't have to be your opponent's creature, create that many 1/1 black insect creature tokens. So with the card we just saw, if we put a counter on itself, you get a 1/1 insect. Now this strikes me as a really good build around card, but one that you need to build around very, very closely, or you need to have a lot of incentive to play it before you include it in your deck. This is a pretty good payoff. If there's any sort of effect that can continuously put -1/-1 counter on things, maybe a tap put a -1/-1 counter on a creature or something along those lines, or some activated ability, then this can get really out of hand. And I'm seeing a lot of build around uncommons in this set already. So this is the type of card that we are going to reevaluate once we get to the end of the set, and once we've seen all of the cards in the set, and see if a -1/-1 themed deck is actually really viable, or if there aren't enough cards floating around with the counters on them to make this really good. If there's a way to put a massive -1/-1 counters on your opponent's creatures, this gets really, really good. So we saw a card, it was a 5/4 demon for 5, and whenever you discard a card or cycle, you put a -1/-1 counter on each of your opponent's creatures. That's when this card just becomes busted, is when you put multiple -1/-1 counters on your opponent's creatures at the same time, or even your own creatures, and you can convert that into 1/1 insect tokens. So we'll see how strong this card is when it becomes clear how much counter generation there's going to be in the set. But that remains to be seen until we get there. As is, it's a card that intrigues me. I think it could be quite powerful in the right kind of deck, but we need to see what support we have for it. Moving right along, we have Flameblade Adept. Flameblade Adept. 1 red for a 1/2 uncommon Jackal Warrior. Creature types are cool. Menace. And whenever you cycle or discard a card, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Now, this is the type of card that I'm not a big fan of when it comes to limited. I don't like all-in aggressive cards like this because they drop off really, really quickly. Also, how often are you going to be discarding multiple cards in the same turn? How often are you going to be cycling in the same turn to make this actually really profitable? If all it did was become a 1/2 menace for 1 mana, that would not be a good card. And giving it a boost. Even like a 2/2 Menace for 1 is decent, right? That's a decent card that you would play in a lot of aggressive decks, but you need to pretty much constantly be getting the trigger going in order for this to be good. Now, where this intrigues me is if there's a way to just pile cycle on cycle on cycle or something like that. Maybe there is like a cycle deck to be had in Limited, but as is, I think this card's a little on the weaker side. I think it's the type of card that looks exciting for people who are very aggressive players, but I am not. I don't like cards that drop off and lose their relevance later in the game, and this looks like one of those cards in my opinions, even though I may be a little bit wrong about that. Maybe this card is just super, super strong, and it's exactly what you're looking for. It is an uncommon, too. Like, that's just something to mention, that it was tested and it was determined that this should be an uncommon. So maybe having something like this at common is good, or is not good, and maybe it is just really powerful. It does seem like it's good in multiples as well, where you can spread out more damage by cycling or discarding cards. But as is, I don't think the card is super great. Prove me wrong, though. I'm sure I'll lose to it, right? It's the type of card that comes down on turn 1 and you're like, oh, great, I'm going to lose a little bit of life, but I don't think I'd be too worried about it. Limits of Solidarity. In case you missed it, there were like already a billion memes about this card because of the sad kitty cat face here, but anyway, the card is Limits of Solidarity. It's 3 and a red for an uncommon sorcery, and it's a threaten. Code word for saying gain control of target creature until end of turn. Untaps, gains haste. We see this in every single set. Like, literally every set has some sort of threat like this. But the perk here, there's always some sort of upside or downside to it, is we have cycling on it. And that makes the card better. I think you would main deck this in a very aggressive deck. A lot of times you see these in sets and you don't want to play them, or they make good sideboard cards, or you need some sort of sacrifice engine in order to really combo with them or something like that. So you leave them out of your deck and they just don't perform super, super well. But they are the type of card that can also just win you the game out of nowhere if you steal your opponent's only blocker and you're super aggressive and you manage to get in a lot of early damage and suddenly you finish off the game, right? And you're going to hear me say this a lot, but Cycling really makes this card. At 4 mana, this sort of effect would not be worth it. It's not a 4 mana type of effect, even when it does win you the game. But Cycling means that if it's not going to win you the game, you get rid of it and you try to draw something else that is going to help you win the game. If you find that it's completely irrelevant, you and your opponent are in a super board stall, your opponent has 50 creatures, and taking one of their creatures isn't going to do anything, cycle this away and draw something else. And that's just the power of Cycling, is that you put that effect on a card that you want to play, and it makes it that much stronger because sometimes even though you want a certain effect in your deck, it may not be relevant to the board state that you have, and you cycle it away and dig for something different. So I think this card is good, and just like I said with the Adept in the last card, it's an uncommon. Like, this is an uncommon for a reason, I imagine. Having this sort of effect at common is very very common. It's a usual thing to see this sort of effect at common in sets, but Cycling is just a powerful ability. It really is, and I think you'll see that a lot. There are a lot of cards that look like they're not strong like this, because we see this effect a million times, but then you tack Cycle onto it, and it gives it a whole different dimension of play. It is worth mentioning that Cycling is a skill-intensive ability. It tests your knowledge on whether or not it's okay to get rid of a card and get some sort of immediate advantage by drawing the card, or if it's better for you to hold on to that card until you have an opportune time to play it and then forego drawing the extra cards, right? So I'm excited to play with Cycling in a limited set. Most of the Cycling I played with in limited is in the form of land Cycling, which is way different. Land Cycling lets you fetch lands. Cycling just is cantripping, right? It lets you draw new cards. So we'll see how it all plays out, but I think cards with Cycling deserve a second look and deserve a little bit of a power bump based solely on having that. Anyway, we have an Aftermath card here. It is Destined and Lead. I guess one way to say it is Destined to Lead. Same with Dusk to Dawn. Maybe that's the theme here with the names. But anyway, the way these work, we've already mentioned it once, is you cast the first side from your hand. If you casting it from your hand, you're always casting the top. And if you're casting it from the graveyard, you're casting the bottom using the Aftermath ability. So there's no way to cast a Lead from your hand, and there's no way to cast Destined from your graveyard. You have to do Destined from your hand and Lead from the graveyard. And that leads to a lot of gimmicks where if you're able to discard this for some sort of cost, or maybe your opponent makes you discard, you now have access to this ability from the graveyard that you wouldn't have had in your hand otherwise. And of course, there are times where you just pay the full 6 mana, you cast the first part from your hand, and then you cast the second part from the graveyard immediately, and then it just functions like a Fuse card where you pay in both mana costs. But this isn't exactly Fuse. It lets you split up when you cast the cards. It's very similar to Fuse, but I don't know, it's a little more separated. It gives you a little more flexibility on when you need the effects and when they're going to be relevant. But the card here we have is Destined, which is 1 in a black. It is an uncommon instant, instant being important. Target creature gets +1/+0 and gains indestructible until end of turn. This is an okay combat trick. It's not as good as the one from Kaladesh that also had a lifelink on it. Or Rush of Vitality is the name of the card. It's definitely not that good. That card was super good because of lifelink and because of other instants at the same mana cost. But Destined is an okay playable combat trick. It means your creature's going to survive, and the little power bump is usually enough that it's going to take out something with it, which I like. Lead from the graveyard is 3 and a green for a sorcery. Aftermath, meaning you can just cast that part from your graveyard. And all creatures able to block target creature this turn do so. I forget what they call these. I guess taunts, maybe? Or provokes. Something along those lines. I'm not sure. But this is the type of effect that I think it's overcosted. 4 mana is a lot for this sort of effect, but it's also the type of card that can just win you the game. Suppose there's a lot of board stalls and your opponent has tons and tons of blockers. You cast lead on a single creature, something you don't care about, or maybe something that you want to trade in combat, and suddenly your opponent has to focus all their attention on that. All of your other creatures get to attack in for the win, right? So 2 very different effects here. The kind of joke being here, if you paid 6 mana, you can make a creature indestructible and have everything block it, but that's a lot for 6 mana. You really only want this if you're going wide or if you have really big creatures and you think you're going to need to break up a board stall. I think Destined is a playable card. I'm not impressed by Lead for its mana cost, but together, again, same thing that we can say for Cyclone cards is that these lead to a little bit of flexibility. Also notice that like you don't have to be playing green to play this card in your deck, right? You can play just Destined as a black card if you're in the market for that. Or if you really need lead in your green deck but you're not playing black, you can find a way to discard it or mill it or something along those lines. So there's a little bit more flexibility in when you can play this in your deck and when you would want this sort of effect. But I don't know. I don't think this card is super strong again, but I like the Destined part more than the lead part, and I'll be on the lookout for games where lead is the type of effect I want. I feel like I'm talking a lot about specific cards here, but it's worth it, right? Because these mechanics are new, and I haven't really talked about the mechanics in depth, but I'll mention them when they come up, like this one that's going to come up here. We have a On-Crop Crasher. On-Crop Crasher is 2 and a red for a 3/2 uncommon Minotaur Warrior. It has haste, and you may exert it as it attacks. When you do, target creature can't block this turn, and it says an exerted creature won't untap during your next untap step. So real quick, the way exert works, I wasn't super keen on this when I saw Glorybringer, which, by the way, is a bomb. Glorybringer is insane. But the way exert works is when you declare this creature as an attacker, the second you choose it as an attacker, you have to make the decision whether or not to exert it. If you don't exert it, nothing happens. But if you do exert it, you get the effect that is tacked onto it, but the creature just doesn't untap during your next untap step. So you don't have to exert. It's completely your choice, but you have to declare it when you're declaring the creature as an attacker. And this one just locks down a creature from blocking. So pretty aggressive card. 3 mana, 3/2. A lot of times if you play this on curve, it will help you get in 3 damage, but you'll lose access to the creature during the next turn. And again, you're going to have to make a decision there. Is it worth getting in the extra damage? Is it worth locking down a blocker to also have this creature immobilized for the next turn? One thing that a lot of people have already mentioned, and it is worth mentioning here, Exert is really good in tandem with Vigilance. If you exert a creature that has Vigilance and it never becomes tapped, the whole exert downside is mitigated. If the creature never becomes tapped, you don't have to worry about it being untapped or not untapping during your next untap step. So I think this card is good. if there's an aggro deck to be had in Limited, which there usually always is, this is the type of card I would be excited to have in my deck. It's just the type of card you can play on turn 3 to get some early damage, or it's the type of card you can play early to just lock down a really relevant blocker and make sure your creatures are able to keep attacking. So I think this is sweet. I'm glad to see Minotaurs back again. And I think Exert is a really neat mechanic, even though we've only seen it on red cards so far. So we'll see how far they go with that. It's interesting. We've only seen Embalm on white cards. We've only seen Exert on red cards, and well, there have been -1/-1 counters on a couple different colors. So we'll see. I think the distribution is a little bit strange, but anyway, a couple more cards here. I think 2 more to be exact. Anointed Priest is 1 in a white. You'll note, neat. Anointed Priest is 1 in a white for a 1/3 common human cleric. Whenever a creature token enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life, and you can embalm it for 3 in a white. Just very quick reminder, that means if this card is in the graveyard, you can pay 3 in a white to exile the card and then get a token that's a copy of it, which is right here. You just basically get the same exact card, but it's a zombie in addition to its other types. It has the same ability, and it's a token instead of a creature card. So really neat, and I think it's absolutely awesome that they made a token for each card. I think that's really cool. It's going to be kind of awkward if you don't get the tokens in the packs, so I don't know how that's going to work out. Like, you're going to be like, hey, did anybody get an Anointed Priest token? But I don't know. This card, I think this card is weak. To be honest, even with the late game ability of Embalm, which always adds a little bit of a value to cards like this, since it gives you something to do with mana late game. It's a mana sink, gives you a little bit of a mana flood insurance, something to use your mana on, so to speak. But the effect's just not that great, right? If this triggered off of every creature that entered your side of the battlefield, it still wouldn't be that strong, and it only triggers off tokens. It is worth noting that I think the idea here is if you're playing a lot of Embalm creatures, you're playing a Embalm deck, which I still don't know if that's going to be a thing or not, then you're gaining a little bit of life back for playing a slower deck. But a 1/3 for 2 doesn't seem like it's going to be amazing, and I don't think like 4 mana to get this sort of thing back is crazy or anything. It's just a little bit of extra value to get out of the card. Maybe life gain's relevant. If there's something that cares about life, you gain in life, then this is a card to reevaluate. But I think the card is weak. That's just my opinion. And I'm saying that for a lot of white cards. White has a lot of late game utility to it with Embalm, but I think the cards we're looking at are just on the weaker side total overall. I think the 3/2 Vigilance so far is the best card we've seen. But again, we've seen mostly commons, which is worth mentioning here. And finally, I believe this is the last card for the day. We have our first god, Hazoret. Hazoret, I guess, is maybe how I'm pronouncing it. Hazoret the Fervent is 3 in a red. It is a 5/4 mythic legendary god creature. It has indestructible and haste. It can't attack or block. Oh yeah, see the masterpiece there. It can't attack or block unless you have 1 or fewer cards in your hand. So you have to have either 0 cards or 1 card in your hand for this to be able to be relevant in combat. And then for 2 in a red, you can discard a card from your hand and deal 2 damage to each opponent, which each opponent should send red flags up in the air for Two-Headed Giant, but that's a different story here. So let's evaluate this card. As is, if you can play this on curve, on turn 4 and attack with it, this card is amazing. Indestructible makes it really hard to deal with. 4 toughness makes it really hard to kind of knock off with -1/-1 counters or something like that. And the activated ability isn't bad either, especially in the late game when you need a little bit of extra reach on your lands or something. Also, it discards cards to the graveyard, so keep that in mind. I've already mentioned that once in this video. If a card says discard, then you want to be on the lookout for things that matter in the graveyard, which also brings us to Standard. I'm not going to talk about it a lot in Standard, but this is a Madness Enabler, right, that deals a little bit of extra damage. Granted, it is a pretty costly activated ability, and there is a huge downside of this possibly not being able to block or attack, which just really, really neuters the card. You need this to be a creature for it to be a really relevant card. If this was just an enchantment or something that said this, then it wouldn't be amazing at all. But I think this card is good. I think in Limited you can really just build an aggressive deck and have this as your top end or one of your top end cards and be empty-handed by turn 4. Even if you play this on turn 4 and then you don't get to attack or do anything with it until turn 5, it's a huge indestructible beater, and your opponent's going to have to find a way to deal with that. They're going to have to exile it or something. It is relevant here since people are used to playing with the Theros gods that this is always a creature. It doesn't matter. There's no devotion or anything weird like that. There's no, oh, it's a creature on the stack, but it stops being a creature in play. You don't have to worry about all that stuff. They took away all that stuff. They stripped the enchantment and devotion thing away from the Theros gods, and they made the Amonkhet gods, which are just equally as awesome, I think, but have a little bit less complexity to them. Now, before we go, again, look at the thing. By the way, Hazoret the pervert, yeah, we get it. It's funny. Before we go, just one thing to mention about the gods, since I imagine we'll see one each day or something like this up to Friday, is they're all going to follow this similar template. They're going to be decent-sized creatures for their mana cost, so 5/4 for 4, obviously being really strong. They're going to be indestructible, plus have another keyword, might be trample, might be flying, something along those lines. They all have this line of text. This god cannot attack or block unless blank. It won't always be fewer cards in hand. It might be something like unless you have 5 or more lands or something like that, or unless you have a certain number of cards in your hand, 6 or more. But they all have a condition to being able to attack and block. And according to Mark Rosewater, the activated ability on each god will help you achieve what you need in order to make it a relevant creature in combat. So if it's something that cares about you having a lot of cards in hand, it might have an activated ability that lets you draw cards or something like that. And that's what we're getting into with the gods. I think they're awesome. I really do. I know we've only seen one so far, but they are the type of card that makes me really excited to play with. I just like cycles of like big mythic legendary things, very similar to the Theros gods. And even though, like I said, they're a little bit less complex, but they also make you a lot they make you make decisions you otherwise wouldn't make with other cards. Like if you have relevant cards in hand, you might be discarding them just so you can attack with this, or you might have to make the decision to hold back the cards in your hand and make this card basically irrelevant in order to cast those cards. So I don't know. We'll see how these things play out, but I think it's pretty exciting. I'm excited to see what the other gods can do. So as always, we're going to double check, make sure we didn't miss any new spoilers that came out recently. It's not quite midnight yet, so I don't think there will be any new ones. But anyway, that's what we're getting into with Amonkhet, and I think it's pretty sweet so far. There's a lot of flavor to this set. There are some really complex mechanics, and I think the mechanics are fantastic. And there are a lot of build-around cards and a lot of really exciting things. I imagine there are going to be a lot of fun games of Limited just because there's so much stuff to do with your mana and so many ways with cycling and embalm and so on and so forth that people are constantly going to be doing things. So there are going to be a lot of interactive games, and I think that's really, really healthy for a Limited format. Not to mention, like, the set just looks cool. Like, they took an Egyptian themed set and they made it look awesome. Like, it's not just all deserts and wastelands. Well, it is, right? But it's really cool to look at, really exciting stuff. Anyway, I'm excited to see what you guys think about it, especially the gods in general and some of the other things. And like I said, if I mention something that's not exactly true, maybe I botched the way one of the mechanic works, let me know below so I can fix that. But anyway, thanks for hanging out with me. We'll be back tomorrow to look at some of the new cards we see spoiled tomorrow. And as always, my name's Timothy, and I'll see you all next time.